Welcome to today's webinar on fire safety in multi-storey blocks. I'm Cassandra Dove, for those that don't know me. I'm part of the policy team here at SFHA and delighted to have you all joining us today. So our speaker for today's session is Hardeep Devsey of the Cladding Remediation Unit at the Scottish Government. I know we've had Hardeep along to a few of our forum sessions before, and most recently as part of our fracturing conference. So we've had kind of, I guess, some further queries relating to this topic. So we thought it warranted a kind of further standalone session, which is why we got this organised for today. And thanks again to Hardeep for making the time to come along. So plan for today, Hardeep's going to go through some slides and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. He has said though that if you've got any questions that come up while he's speaking, then please feel free to set your hand up, or you can use the chat function as well. Anything we don't pick up during the presentation, we can come to at the end though. So when you join the session today, your microphone will be automatically muted. If you do want to speak when you're asking your question, then again, just raise your hand and unmute yourself when prompted. Also good if you could say who you are and where you're from. Again, in terms of the video, up to you if you want to have that on or off. But just to make you aware, we are recording the session today. So everyone who attends will be sent that recording afterwards. So I think that's everything from me for now. So I'll hand over to Hardeep, and then we'll come back to any kind of questions as part of the Q&A. So over to you, Hardeep.
Thank you, Cassandra, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to come along today and speak about fire safety in residential blocks in Scotland. I'll give you an overview and run through the slides, and as Cassandra says, if you've got any questions, just put them in the chat. I'll try and see the chat at the same time. So hopefully I'll be able to pick them up. What I'll also do is stop my video just in case that might cause bandwidth problems. So I will ask for the next slide, please. So in terms of fire safety, the timeline obviously in most recent times has begun with Grenfell. And the Grenfell tragedy kicked off a whole load of work, both in the UK government as well as in Scotland. And it started with the creation of the Building and Fire Safety Ministerial Working Group, which then led on to the Mortgage Lending and Cladding Working Group, mainly because what then became apparent was that the Grenfell situation had caused lenders and insurers to begin to ask questions about the nature of the structure of buildings, as well as what's on the outside, but what's also on the inside. So that then prompted them to create a form called an EWS1 form, which then resulted in mortgages being withdrawn, or people finding it difficult to be able to secure mortgage lending. And then obviously that caused the link between lending and cladding, and thus spawned the creation of that working group. We received funding in terms of consequentials from UK government, and then that then justified the creation of a brand new programme of work to bring about single building assessments. And they were started, or at least that programme was started in March 2021. Our unit was created in June 2021, and we are now going to be a division, and that has now been established in the winter of 2022. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, where did all this come from? So, RICS, UK Finance, and the Building Society Association needed to find a way to quickly identify risks associated with buildings, and so their mechanism of doing that was to create a form called the External Wall System form, and what that form attempted to do was to at least identify into 5 broad categories the status of buildings. And as the definition there shows, the form is designed for any residential property, blocks of flats, of any kind of mixed tenureship. And the form is designed to apply to an entire building or a block, and also may be relevant in terms of mixed use buildings. Now I've got 2 slides here, one, and this is a direct lift from the RICS guidance, because what this shows is that the RICS guidance actually is not necessarily as clear-cut as you think. So some people would say, well, it's actually only applicable for above 18 metres. Some people would say it's actually above 11 metres, but actually the decision tree, as this is what this is referring to, shows that actually, depending on what's on the building, dictates whether or not you need the EWS1. So in terms of the cladding on the system, on the external wall system, one of the first questions they ask is it over 6 stories? And if the answer is yes, then automatically you should get an EWS1. Then it goes down into what type of cladding is on the building, and that's step number 3. Now, if you've got ACMPE, which is aluminium composite material, or MCM, which is multi-composite material, or HPL, which is high pressure laminate, that's a trigger point as well that says yes, you need an EWS1. Then they also ask the question, is the building over 4 stories? So that's where actually the threshold point comes down. So 4 stories, it's roughly about 3 metres per story, so that's roughly about 12 metres. However, the threshold is set at 11 metres, mainly because that gives you that opportunity to also dip down into the 3-storey buildings, because there are some 3-storey buildings that do have cladding on them, which actually does present fire risk, so therefore they would be included as well. So in terms of the external wall, this flowchart is actually used by surveyors. So when a surveyor comes along, does a home report on a building or for a certain property, they would then make that determination to understand whether or not this building requires an external wall appraisal. Now, most surveyors that produce home reports aren't qualified fire risk assessors. So what tends to happen is they look at the building based on height, and then they think, is there any cladding visible? So they look at step number 1. And then immediately, if they just don't know what's on it, they just say, really sorry, but you're going to have to get an EWS1. So they go straight to EWS1. Then what would have to be required is, for a building over 6 stories, you need a qualified and incorporated fire engineer to actually make an assessment of buildings above 18 metres. So so that category has been defined. So you need a fire engineer for a building above 6 stories. However, the reason why you've got the 4-storey mark or the 11-metre mark is if you've got a surveyor that has actually got an appropriate fire risk assessment qualification, specifically the RICS one, the one that's produced by RICS, funded by the UK government, if they're qualified, then they can do a fire risk assessment of a building between 11 metres and 18 metres. So that's meant to alleviate the market, because the market's quite challenging at the moment with regards to the number of fire engineers available to do this work. So that means that if you can find, and they are quite difficult to find, if you can find a surveyor who is qualified, then they can do your fire risk assessment of your external wall between 11 and 18 metres. So this diagram, basically produced by RICS, shows the decision tree for which you would make that determination of whether or not you need an EWS1. And again, the reason why it becomes quite problematic in Scotland is because of our tenure system. So if any flatted property requires to be bought or sold, lenders have said that they would like an EWS1 for any relevant buildings. So if you've got a building of mixed ownership, so you may have mixed properties whereby certain flats are in private ownership, certain flats are tenanted. So unfortunately, those flats that are in private ownership where a mortgage would be required would have to get an EWS1. However, that is the responsibility of the homeowner. It doesn't rest with the actual owner necessarily of the building, because we've got a situation where we've got an RSL where they've sold one flat in a building, and it's got 6 flats. It's only 3 stories high, and one flat owner in that building had to get their own EWS1 in order to sell their flat. Next slide, please. So what you'll see here now is the additional guidance from RICS is, what do you do in a building that's got balconies? So they've got additional requirements when it comes to balconies. And again, what you'll see here is the 18-metre or the 6-storey threshold point is not relevant at this point, because obviously you've passed those steps for the first 5 steps. So now we're getting into, does this building have balconies? And yes. Is the building over 6 stories? No, then the EWS one shouldn't be requested. But equally, what they're focused here on are stacked balconies. So we've got questions around the fire safety of stacked balconies, especially where timber is involved, and especially where timber runs up the side of the building. So again, in those scenarios, we've got evidence where EWS ones have been commissioned. Now, if you like further information about this, again, these slides will be shared with everyone. So the links to this particular guidance from RICS can be found in these 2 links. But again, it is quite convoluted because the assessment of risk is actually determined by a qualified assessor. So that assessor may look at your building and may actually make a determination that even though there's combustible material on your building, it's of a sufficient low risk that it presents minimal risk to the building. And so therefore they may actually prepare an EWS one and actually be quite content to pass your building as low risk. But again, happy to answer any questions about that towards the end. Next slide, please. So in terms of assessment of fire risk, so the Scottish Government has created a single building assessment process, and that was in conjunction with our colleagues in Scottish Fire and Rescue, it was in conjunction with Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, but we've got an internal unit called the Fire Rescue Unit, as well as Building Standards colleagues, and we jointly worked together to create the Scottish Advice Note. I've got another slide on the Scottish Advice Note, so I'll get to that later. So the single building assessment is open to buildings of any tenureship. So it's free, fully funded by the Scottish Government. We will commission it, and so far on the single building assessment pilot, we are currently dealing with 105 buildings, of which we've got probably about 27 quite active buildings within that pilot phase, where we're testing the single building assessment process. And of those 27, I think off the top of my head, I think there's 5 RSLs within that cohort of buildings. And again, we have a variety of different buildings, different heights, different challenges on buildings. But the main outcome is that we need to make that determination of whether or not those risks exist. And so it's based on life safety risks, but specifically associated with the fire risk elements that are defined in the Scottish Advice Note. What the single building assessment will do, though, is also clearly state where the risks are, and then support the identification of any solutions, which will then help bring the rating of that building down to a low risk rating. Ideally, what we want is that a single building assessment, as the name suggests, should provide that single building holistic view of fire risk and reduce the need for an EWS1. So a single building assessment has that EWS1 integrated into the assessment. So as we produce a single building assessment, it should mean all flats within a property are covered. And we're working with UK Finance on making sure that they are content with that approach, so that they will use that single building assessment and then allow mortgage lending to continue for those flats. In terms of the liability and decision making, so this comes back down to the scope of funding. Ultimately, the single building assessment needs to identify the root cause of issues. So there may be a situation where some of the issues presented on that building actually lie with some decisions that were made by the homeowners. And so, unfortunately, in those such situations, homeowners may be liable for those costs to rectify those fire risks. In terms of risks associated with the cladding system, Scottish Government again have said that we would fund remediation, especially on the orphan buildings. And again, we're working with developers and some of the country's largest home builders to ensure that they would then step forward and address issues with the external wall for buildings that they're associated with. But all of that has to be in agreement with homeowners and building owners, because ultimately, again, that assessment of risk has to find out where that root cause has come from. But again, you know, each building is quite different, and as a result, the assessment of risk is quite different. So there is no real hard and fast rules, but every building has to be assessed on a building by building basis. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Scottish Advice Note was created by Building Standards in conjunction with other policy colleagues within government. It's there to make that determination of fire risk associated with the external wall, especially in multi-storey residential buildings. It's there, and as the name suggests, it is an advice note. It's not enshrined in law. It's not mandated. Say, for example, by the insurance industry or by the lending industry. Ultimately, we use it as part of the Single Building Assessment Programme to assess fire risk posed by the external wall system. But the reality is that the advice note can be used by anyone, and it's not limited by jurisdiction. There is another British standard called the PAS 9980, and the truth is that the PAS and the Scottish Advice Note are both companion documents. They're both methodologies for assessing fire risk. And again, a good quality incorporated chartered fire engineer or a qualified surveyor should be able to make the determination of utilising either methodology or both methodologies to assess the fire risk. Because once they've identified the fire risk, then ultimately we can then make a determination on remediation. But the SAN looks at, as those bullet points have identified, cladding systems, support rails, cavity barriers, and so on, insulation materials, panels used in terms of rain screens, balconies, solar shading, and so on, as well as architectural aesthetic type features that may not necessarily have any link to, say, the thermal U values of buildings, but essentially any type of cladding system on the building needs to be assessed, both in terms of fire risk, but as well as in terms of how it impacts on the internal risks, because it is a holistic view of the building. Next slide, please. So in terms of our programme, we have committed to funding, fully funding, free of charge, single building assessments, again, to any building of any tenureship. The outputs of the SBA define the scope of works that may be required for remediation. And remember, as much as I'm talking here about worst case scenarios, we do hope that an awful lot of the buildings that we will ultimately assess will come straight through the process and be rated as low risk. And the reason why we do hope that is because the Scottish Building Standard since 2005 had a higher degree of fire risk associated with the building of buildings. So we do hope that change in legislation in 2005 meant that any buildings or any changes to buildings that have happened since then should be safer. But then again, we will never really know until we've done that assessment. So the SBA is free, and that's part of the reason we do need to make this assessment to determine risks. And then ultimately that will bring buildings back into a safe EWS1 rating or a safe rating for low risk. We do have a Scottish Safer Buildings Accord, and that currently is in development, and we're working quite closely with developers to bring them into alignment with the whole approach taken by the SBA, so that we can make that similar determination of risks, so that when developers are assessing buildings or we're assessing buildings, we all come to the same conclusion, and ultimately that leads developers to step forward and remediate buildings that they're associated with. Government funding has been committed for orphan buildings, so those are buildings where the developer is no longer in existence, and then as point 4, and as I mentioned earlier, our ultimate aim is to make sure that we have that assessment of the whole building, and we reduce the need for the need for homeowners to commission their own EWS ones, and that single building should suffice in terms of providing that whole building assessment of risk, especially after any remediation has been done. And then finally, one of the key things that we aim to create is a register of buildings to hold that fire safety information, including EWS1 ratings. And that register of buildings should be accessible by a variety of different organisations, namely lenders, insurers would need to access it, solicitors may need to access it as well, because they would need to make a determination of whether or not a flat that's been that someone wants to purchase is on the register of safe buildings. And then also you may, not solicitors, but estate agents, that's it. Estate agents may also want to access the information to provide advice to any prospective homeowners who are seeking to sell their home, because you may have a situation where a homeowner isn't even aware that a single building assessment has been conducted on their building, and actually their building has actually been rated as safe. I'll pause there because I see there's a question. Does the SBA have a legal standing? Will owners require to carry out the recommendations identified? So the SBA does not have a legal standing. It is not defined within either building standards legislation or housing legislation. Are homeowners compelled or required to carry out the recommendations? That's a very good question, because ultimately the answer to that is homeowners own their building, and ultimately all decision making rests with them. So that does create quite a bit of a interesting conundrum, whereas Scottish Government are providing an assessment free of charge. We commission the assessment. The assessment, let's say for example, says yes, your building has cladding risks, for example, on the top floor. So the whole building might be made of block work, but only the top floor, and let's say the top floor has timber on the top floor, and the homeowners make their own determination and say, no, we're quite content to live with that risk. And if, and again, this is where you get some caveats here, if they're content to pay, may say, slightly higher insurance premiums, and if those insurance premiums don't necessarily have an impact on mortgage lending, then maybe those homeowners can, and they're perfectly within their legal right to do so, they're perfectly happy to live with that risk. On the other hand, we do have buildings in the pilot where the fire risk is so severe that in actual fact, those buildings really do need remediation. And then from that perspective, our role at the moment is to work with those homeowners to say, look, Scottish Government has stepped forward, we're willing to provide financial contributions in terms of remediating the cladding system on the outside. And in certain buildings, we've got the developer that has stepped forward to say that they're going to fully fund any remediation. So it's all about clustering that support to homeowners, because the last thing that we as a government, as well as developers, don't want is for people to live in buildings with risks. Now, my opinion is that if the risk is so severe, I think we would get consent from homeowners, from developers, and from ourselves to be able to remediate those buildings. I think where we do have that interesting conundrum, though, is where the cladding risk is like literally borderline. And with borderline risks, then yes, then there is that decision that needs to be made by homeowners, and they can make that decision because if they are happy to pay slightly higher insurance premiums, then maybe that's the approach that those homeowners wish to take. And again, we have to comply with the title deeds, because the title deeds are actually what determine what the decision making is within certain buildings. Certain buildings have title deeds that say all building owners or all owners within a building must provide consent in order for anything to proceed, whilst other title deeds allow for the homeowner association to make that executive decision on behalf of all other homeowners. So it does present quite a difficult conundrum. And like I said earlier, we are working on a building by building basis, and we have in our pilot various different challenges associated with all those different scenarios. So we are dealing with all those scenarios at the moment in those 27 buildings, and probably as we widen that 27 to the 105 that we are also dealing with, as they go through the process, we'll undoubtedly experience some of those challenges as well. So next slide, please. So in terms of the Scottish Housing Regulator, I spoke with the Director of Regulation, and one of the things that in that discussion, because I wanted to relay to her the status of some of the, or sorry, not the status, but the kind of evidence that we're getting back from some of the buildings in the pilot. And she was quite interested to hear about some of the challenges that we've had in terms of the management of buildings. So what we tend to find is that buildings in private ownership, where the whole building has been is in private ownership, there seems to be this grey area about who manages the maintenance of the building itself, the actual physical structure of the building, the external wall. And I'll get on to the role of duty holders later in the presentation. But when I shared that with the Director of Regulation, she then pointed me in the direction of this recommended practice on asset management, and she was quite positive about the fact that social landlords do have this guide, and it is a recommendation. It's not necessarily enshrined within any kind of regulation, because it is recommended practice. It is advisory. Landlords are not necessarily required to follow it, but they should consider applying it, applying the recommendations in full or at least in part. And I think that's one thing that RSLs have got an advantage over, is that you do have the housing regulator that helps provide support in terms of asset management and the assessment of the stock within which you've got responsibility for. So in relation to that, one of the things that we are doing in parallel is that in effect, these principles we are also taking into those discussions that we're having with property factors, because we are saying that from a property factor perspective, what is your role in understanding how you manage your asset? And that leads on to the role of the duty holder. And some of the uncomfortable conversations that we're having with homeowners is the fact that property factors provide services within the scope of service that they have agreed and under contract to with those homeowners. And anything that falls out with that band, unfortunately, means actually the homeowners themselves are duty holders for that asset that they should be managing. And that asset includes the external wall, the actual building itself, the roof, and so on. And so from that perspective, the difficult conversation to have with homeowners is that, well, actually you need to manage your asset, and yes, you work with your property factor in relation to the management of that asset. And in terms of the single building assessment, you can commission the single building assessment to help you understand the asset and what the management of that asset may necessarily entail. So again, we're quite grateful to the regulator for producing these, because we've actually helped property factors and homeowners understand what some of those duties could be or should be for their buildings. So next slide, please. So leading on to some of the slides that we talked through at previous conferences. So one of my colleagues, James Clark from the Fire Rescue Unit, provided these slides. And again, this is about Scottish Fire and Rescue Services' role when it comes to the Fire Scotland Act, and how they, as are an enforcement, or they have enforcement duties associated within the Act. And again, it relates to Scottish Regulations 2006 and the Fire Scotland Act 2005 in relation to, especially centred around the protection of firefighters as they attend any associated fire incident. I think where the challenge comes in is that the Fire Scotland Act very heavily is associated with commercial entities, but has limited linkage with domestic. But I'll lead on to where that linkage is relevant. So next slide, please. So where it becomes relevant in terms of domestic buildings is Regulation 24, and this is in relation to the maintenance of the common areas. And so as this diagram shows, the common areas are the entrance, the corridor, service, the service floor, or any other kind of common area associated with that particular building. And so therefore the under Regulation 24, the SFRS do have responsibility for ensuring that buildings are safe, not just for residents, but also for the protection of firefighters. So SFRS very rarely come out to domestic blocks to do an inspection of the common areas, because this again relates to the responsibilities of the duty holder. But they do come out, especially when we've flagged issues that we've identified on certain buildings. So I personally have been on an SFRS assessment of one of the buildings in the pilot, where we did actually tour all of the common areas and make some notes of some of the fire risks associated with those common areas. So one thing that's not on this diagram, which we did do an inspection of, is the car park spaces, both internal car park spaces, underground car park spaces, as well as the car park spaces around the building, because they presented some quite significant challenges for SFRS because of the material stored in those car park spaces underground, which then presented a fire risk, and then that formed part of the SFRS report, which was then handed to the factor and then presented to the homeowners. So again, SFRS are an enforcement body, especially in terms of providing that protection to homeowners and firefighters, specifically within those common areas. Next slide, please. Yep. So in terms of duty holders, I think to summarise these 4 bullet points, James's advice has been, if you are responsible for the management of the maintenance of any element of that building, then that makes you a duty holder for that element that you are managing. So if you're a property factor and you have taken on responsibility for maintaining the external wall, then that makes you a duty holder for the external wall. However, the ultimate duty holder is the building owner, because factors, especially in private residential blocks, are only there under contract. And so from that perspective, they can walk away from that contract, or that contract can be withdrawn by the homeowners themselves. So in that particular situation, if that were to happen, if the factor was to walk away from their role within a building, then the automatic duty holder then rests on the building owner or the individual homeowners or collective homeowners for that particular building. However, again, if you look at the second bullet point there, this might include managing agents, landlords and tenants, because if you are responsible for the management of the maintenance of a particular element of that building, then you're the duty holder. So for example, that may include the management of the maintenance of something that's inside your flat. And if that becomes an aspect associated with the overall fire safety of a building, then you become a duty holder for that element. So in one of the buildings that we're dealing with, we've got a slight challenge whereby we're trying to install a fire alarm system, and that fire alarm system should, or should I say, could extend into the individual flats of the building. So therefore, if the fire alarm went off in the main area of the building, it should cascade the fire alarm into individual flats. Now, the challenge that we've got is that some of those homeowners do not consent to that fire alarm being installed in their own properties. So that's something that we are working on. And I mean, again, the Scottish Government has no legal basis with which to compel homeowners to do these things. At the moment, we are doing this and obviously providing this free of charge. So therefore, we're hoping that the free of charge part should be a good motivator for this. But again, we are making that assumption that should motivate homeowners, but we don't necessarily have the legal powers to compel. In terms of that question, SFRs do carry out quarterly visits to high-rise buildings. That's correct. They do. In terms of the SFRS colleagues that we've seen, they do come out, but what we've noticed is that the single building assessment is throwing up things that they themselves don't necessarily catch, because obviously our inspections are much more intrusive. They are going underneath the actual cladding panels, looking at the cladding systems. They're looking at the holistic view of fire risks. And so we're going beyond what a normal SFRS assessment would do. But as a result, what that's flagging up is additional risks that we then pass on to SFRS. SFRS are aware of those and then factor those in to any local plans for their response to specific buildings. So we are working quite closely with them, and like I said, our assessments are actually supplementing their plans for how they would address a fire at a high risk building. So next slide. I think this is my last one. Don't sure. Oh, so in terms of outcomes, so the ultimate outcome from the approach that we're taking in terms of the single building assessment programme, but wider, what Scottish Government is doing, both in terms of fire rescue unit as well as housing, is that we're trying to cluster all of the legislation around to make sure that all the different legislation knits together and provides that holistic view of fire risk and protection for homeowners, residents and tenants. So again, it's all about meeting the expectations of anyone living in a building. And we are focused on life safety. So life safety is our primary driver for this. So the reason why I'm saying life safety is that insurance companies make their determination of premiums based on building safety. And building safety and life safety are two different risk scoring profiles. So the insurance industry make their determination of the premium that you need to be charged for your building based upon the inherent risk of damage to the actual building. And we make our determination of risk of how risky is the building in terms of fire risk and how quickly can we get people out of the building. And by getting people out of the building, that should then ensure that SFRS can then attend the building safely, make sure people are out the building, and then, because they know what the fire risks are on the building, can then take the appropriate steps to remediate any risk associated with that fire as quickly as possible. As I said earlier, we will produce that register of buildings, and that should be that single source of truth about which buildings have passed a single building assessment, what is their rating. But one thing to note is that not all buildings need a single building assessment, and there may be a situation where other individual buildings may still continue to commission their own EWS ones. So there may be buildings that will go through the single building assessment process, and there may be buildings that have chosen not to, because again, it's entirely voluntary. Scottish Government is not, it does not have the legislative power to step beyond the rights of homeowners or RSLs or local authorities. It is all demand led, and so from that perspective, we will deliver a single building assessment upon request, but ultimately there is no compulsion, and it comes back to the point that John had said there, or the question that John had asked, which is, does the SBA have a legal standing? And at the moment, it doesn't. What we also, moving on to the fourth bullet point, we also need to make sure that as we get to the end of the process of an SBA, that those duty holder rights as well as duty holder responsibilities are clearly understood. We need the homeowners to really understand what their responsibilities are, but equally what we're doing is we're working with property factors and various different property factor associations to work with them to actually help them understand where they actually may be overstepping the bounds of their scope of service and inadvertently becoming duty holders. So again, we're working quite closely with that, and what we need to make sure is that when we get to the end of this process, there is complete clarity of who's responsible for what elements of a building, and ideally what we'd want to get to is some sort of building maintenance plan for a building, whereby we can then allocate roles and responsibilities both to homeowners in terms of duty holders as well as to property factors if required. But again, it all depends on the nature of the building and the support that we need to provide to the building owners and the property factors on managing the maintenance, because cladding systems can be quite complex and so therefore do require complex management systems. So again, we need to make sure that both the duty holders and the factors are aware of that when we get to the end of the process. And finally, again, just to reiterate, the single building assessment is free to buildings of all different types, mixed tenureship and so on. And so from that perspective, it is free to RSLs and local authorities. And as I said, I think at the start, of the 27 buildings that are active in the programme, and of the 125, I think we've got approximately in total 11 RSLs in the 125, but I think of the 27 we're dealing with, there's 5 that are currently quite active in the whole process of going through the single building assessment process. So I think that's my last slide. So I'm